Carl Jung once said that the shadow, the dark, repressed part of the psyche, becomes most dangerous not when it's acknowledged, but when it's denied. For years, the empath denies their shadow. They suppress their anger, swallow their resentment, and convince themselves that their capacity to endure mistreatment is a virtue. They wear their patience like armor, and their forgiveness like a badge of honor. But Jung understood something the narcissist never does. The longer you repress the shadow, the more powerful it becomes. And when it finally emerges, it doesn't whisper. It roars. The narcissist operates under a fatal assumption that the empath's kindness is weakness, that their tolerance is stupidity, that their silence is consent. They mistake the empath's choice to remain peaceful for an inability to be dangerous. They confuse compassion with cowardice. And this mistake costs them everything. Because a fed-up empath isn't just angry. They're awakened. And an awakened empath is the most dangerous adversary a narcissist will ever face. The danger doesn't come from violence or vengeance. It comes from something far more lethal: clarity. The empath who once saw the narcissist through the soft filter of potential and possibility now sees them with brutal, unflinching accuracy. Every manipulation tactic becomes transparent. Every guilt trip becomes obvious. Every lie stands out like blood on snow. Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward becoming whole by integrating all parts of yourself, including the parts you've been taught to hide. The empath's journey toward individuation begins the moment they stop abandoning themselves to accommodate someone else. And once that journey starts, there's no going back. The fed-up empath stops performing emotional labor. This seems like a small thing until you realize that the narcissist's entire world was built on that unpaid, unacknowledged labor. The empath was the translator who made the narcissist's cruelty sound like honesty. The PR manager who spun their abuse into misunderstanding. The emotional shock absorber who prevented them from ever facing the natural consequences of their behavior. Without the empath's interference, reality comes crashing in. The narcissist suddenly has to manage their own reputation, regulate their own emotions, clean up their own messes. And they can't. Because they never learned how. They never had to. The empath was always there, cleaning up behind them like an invisible servant. But the danger goes deeper than just withdrawal of services. A fed-up empath becomes a mirror, and Jung understood that nothing terrifies people more than being forced to see their true reflection. The empath stops pretending, stops cushioning reality, stops translating toxicity into acceptability. They reflect back exactly what they're receiving, with no distortion, no softening, no mercy. When the narcissist rages, the empath no longer absorbs it. They reflect it back with calm clarity. When the narcissist manipulates, the empath names it out loud without flinching. When the narcissist plays victim, the empath refuses to play rescuer. This mirroring is unbearable for someone whose entire identity depends on never seeing themselves clearly. Jung wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. The narcissist has spent their entire life avoiding that confrontation. The empath was their accomplice in that avoidance, always providing distractions, always offering new chances, always believing the performance of change over the pattern of behavior. But the fed-up empath withdraws their participation in the charade. They stop believing the lies. Stop accepting the excuses. Stop hoping for transformation that isn't coming. And without that hope, without that belief, the narcissist's illusions collapse. The empath becomes dangerous because they know too much. They've seen behind the mask. They've cataloged the patterns. They understand the cycle better than the narcissist understands it themselves. They know which buttons were installed and how they were programmed to respond. And now they simply refuse to be programmed anymore. This knowledge is power, but the empath doesn't wield it like a weapon. They don't need to expose the narcissist publicly or destroy their reputation. The empath's power is in their absence. They remove themselves from the equation entirely, and the whole system collapses. Jung believed that what you resist persists, but what you accept transforms. The fed-up empath has finally accepted the truth they resisted for years. Some people don't want to heal. Some people are comfortable in their dysfunction. Some people will choose their ego over connection every single time. And no amount of love, patience, or understanding will change that. This acceptance is what makes them dangerous. Because a person who has accepted reality can't be manipulated with false hope. They can't be guilt-tripped with reminders of potential. They can't be love-bombed back into the cycle. They've seen the pattern too many times. They know how it ends. The narcissist loses their grip because the empath has finally found theirs. Not on the narcissist. They've let go of that entirely. But on themselves. On their own worth. On their right to peace. On their refusal to participate in their own destruction. Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The fed-up empath has finally claimed that privilege. And in doing so, they become someone the narcissist never anticipated, someone who doesn't need them, doesn't fear them, and doesn't think about them at all. That indifference, that complete and total disinterest, is more dangerous than any revenge could ever be. Because it means the narcissist has lost the only thing they ever really wanted, power over someone else's inner world. And once that power is gone, it's gone forever. Jung warned that the meeting with oneself belongs to the most unpleasant things that can be avoided as long as we can project everything negative into the environment. The narcissist has mastered this projection, casting all their shame, inadequacy, and emptiness onto the empath. And for years, the empath accepted it, carried it, tried to transform it into something manageable. But when the empath finally refuses to carry what isn't theirs, something catastrophic happens for the narcissist. They're forced to hold their own darkness. And they have no idea how. This is where the fed-up empath becomes truly lethal. Not through action, but through stillness. They stop moving, stop reacting, stop engaging. They become unmovable, and suddenly the narcissist is shadowboxing with their own reflection. Every insult bounces back. Every manipulation attempt falls flat. Every attempt to provoke a reaction meets only silence. The narcissist escalates because escalation always worked before. They rage harder, manipulate more desperately, perform increasingly dramatic crises. But the fed-up empath has access to what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold tension without collapsing into it. They can witness the storm without becoming it. They can observe the chaos without trying to calm it. This neutrality is maddening to someone who feeds on emotional reactions. The narcissist's entire strategy depends on keeping the empath emotionally activated, constantly defending themselves, forever explaining, always trying to prove their worth. But the empath who has integrated their shadow no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. Jung understood that we cannot change anything unless we accept it. The fed-up empath has accepted that the narcissist is exactly who they've always been. Not who they pretended to be during love bombing. Not who they promised to become after each violation. But who they actually are, as demonstrated through consistent patterns over time. This acceptance births a devastating clarity. The empath sees that the narcissist's cruelty wasn't about them at all. It was always about the narcissist's internal emptiness, their fragmented sense of self, their desperate need for external validation to feel real. The empath was just a mirror the narcissist used to avoid looking at themselves. But now the empath has removed themselves from that role. They've stopped being the narcissist's emotional support system, their reality checker, their audience. And without an audience, the narcissist's performance loses all meaning. The danger intensifies because the fed-up empath develops something the narcissist cannot comprehend: genuine indifference. Not the performed kind, where you pretend not to care while secretly hoping they'll notice. But the real kind, where you've processed the pain, integrated the lessons, and moved so far forward that looking back feels like visiting a museum of someone else's life. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. The narcissist has never done this and never will. They've built an elaborate false self to hide from the shame of their true self. The empath's journey is the opposite. They've finally stopped hiding. They've integrated their rage, their selfishness, their capacity for coldness. They've accepted that they're not infinite in their capacity to give, that they have limits, that they're allowed to prioritize their own well-being. This integration makes them impervious to the tactics that once controlled them. The guilt trips don't land because the empath has differentiated between real guilt and manufactured obligation. The threats of abandonment don't work because the empath has learned that being alone is better than being diminished. The promises of change don't seduce because the empath now trusts patterns over words. The narcissist realizes too late that they're dealing with someone fundamentally different from the person they initially trapped. The empath has died and been reborn. Not in a metaphorical way, but in the psychological death Jung described, the ego death that precedes transformation. The old empath who needed to be needed, who derived worth from being useful, who feared conflict more than disrespect, that person no longer exists. What remains is someone who has stared into their own abyss and survived it. Someone who knows their own darkness and isn't afraid of it anymore. Someone who can access their own cruelty if needed but chooses not to because cruelty serves no purpose. This restraint is not weakness, it's the ultimate power. Jung said that where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking. The narcissist operates entirely from the will to power. But the fed-up empath has transcended both. They no longer seek power over the narcissist, nor do they offer love. They've moved into a third space, complete autonomy. This autonomy is what makes them dangerous. They don't need closure. They don't need the last word. They don't need the narcissist to understand what they did wrong. They don't need vindication or validation or revenge. They've given all of those things to themselves. The narcissist keeps waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the empath to explode, to seek revenge, to expose them, to make them pay. But the shoe never drops. Because the empath isn't thinking about the narcissist at all. They're too busy building a life that the narcissist can't touch, infiltrate, or poison. Jung believed that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. The empath carried the narcissist's unlived life for years. Their unprocessed trauma, their unacknowledged shame, their unexpressed humanity. But the fed-up empath has finally set that burden down and walked away. And the narcissist is left holding everything they tried so desperately to avoid, themselves. Alone. Without a mirror to distort the reflection. Without an empath to process their emotions. Without anyone to blame. That's the real danger of a fed-up empath. Not what they do to the narcissist, but what they stop doing. They stop being the buffer between the narcissist and reality. And reality has no patience for people who refuse to grow. Jung observed that the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. The narcissist has spent their entire life running from their inner world, and so their fate arrives in the form of the one person who saw through them completely, the fed-up empath. The empath's transformation completes in a way the narcissist never anticipated. They don't become bitter or hardened. They become discerning. And discernment is far more dangerous than bitterness because it's rooted in wisdom rather than woundedness. The bitter person can still be manipulated through their pain. The discerning person cannot be manipulated at all. This discernment allows the empath to see the narcissist as a complete system rather than isolated incidents. They understand now that the love bombing wasn't real affection, it was the bait. The devaluation wasn't a rough patch, it was the inevitable reveal. The discard wasn't abandonment, it was the natural conclusion of a transaction that had run its course. Every phase was calculated, even if the narcissist wasn't consciously aware of their own patterns. Jung taught that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The narcissist remains unconscious, repeating the same cycles with different people, always believing this time will be different. But the empath has made their unconscious conscious. They've examined every wound, traced every pattern back to its origin, understood why they accepted unacceptable treatment. This self-knowledge makes them untouchable. The narcissist tries the old tricks, hoovering with nostalgia, manufacturing crises that require the empath's intervention, playing victim to appeal to their savior complex. But the empath has dismantled their savior complex. They've recognized it for what it was, a defense mechanism that let them focus on fixing others instead of facing themselves. The danger escalates when the empath begins to thrive. Not just survive, but genuinely flourish. They discover that the energy they were pouring into a black hole of neediness can actually fuel their own dreams. They find that relationships don't have to be exhausting negotiations. They learn that peace isn't boring, it's restorative. They realize that the drama they thought was passion was actually just chaos. This thriving is unbearable for the narcissist to witness. It contradicts everything they told the empath about themselves. They said the empath was too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding, too much. But now the empath is thriving with people who celebrate those exact qualities. They said the empath would never find anyone who would tolerate them. But now the empath is surrounded by people who don't tolerate them, they cherish them. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. The narcissists believed they were transforming the empath into something diminished, something controllable. They never considered that the empath would transform into something stronger, something free. The fed-up empath becomes dangerous because they stop speaking the narcissist's language. They no longer engage in circular arguments designed to confuse rather than resolve. They don't defend themselves against false accusations. They don't explain their boundaries, they simply enforce them. They don't argue about reality, they just live in it and let the narcissist live in whatever delusion they prefer. This refusal to engage is more powerful than any confrontation. Because confrontation still feeds the narcissist. It proves they still matter, still have impact, still occupy space in the empath's emotional world. But when the empath treats them with the polite distance you'd show a stranger, when there's no heat in their responses, no investment in being understood, that's when the narcissist realizes they've lost something irretrievable. Jung believed that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. The empath achieves wholeness by integrating the parts of themselves they'd rejected, their anger, their selfishness, their capacity to say no without guilt. They discover they can be both compassionate and boundaried, both kind and unavailable, both loving and completely done with you. This integration creates a centered power that no external force can shake. The narcissist tries to destabilize them with new attacks, recruiting others to their narrative, spreading lies, playing victim to anyone who will listen. But the empath no longer needs to defend their truth. They know what happened. They know who they are. And the opinions of people who weren't there, who don't know the full story, who are being manipulated by a professional liar, those opinions hold no weight. The fed-up empath has learned what Jung knew, that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. They've stopped contorting themselves into shapes that fit someone else's needs. They've stopped apologizing for having standards. They've stopped explaining why they deserve basic respect. In the end, the narcissist discovers that the person they thought they controlled was never truly in their grasp. The empath was always powerful, they just didn't know it yet. The narcissist didn't create the empath's weakness. They exploited a temporary blind spot. And once that blind spot was illuminated, once the empath saw clearly what was happening, the narcissist's power evaporated like morning fog. Jung said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The narcissist will never do that work, will never look inward, will never grow. But the empath did. And that's why they're dangerous. Not because they seek to destroy, but because they can no longer be destroyed. They become what the narcissist fears most, someone who doesn't need them, doesn't fear them, and doesn't think about them at all. And there's no manipulation tactic, no hoovering attempt, no smear campaign that can undo that transformation. The empath has left the building. And the narcissist is alone with the one person they've spent their entire life running from, themselves. Jung observed that the shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. The narcissist never understood this. They believed their reality was the only reality, their perspective the only valid one, their needs the only ones that mattered. They built a world where the empath's role was fixed, unchangeable, permanent. But the fed-up empath has rewritten the entire script. And they did it without asking permission. This is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the transformed empath. They've stopped seeking approval for their choices. They don't need the narcissist to validate their decision to leave. They don't need mutual friends to understand why they walked away. They don't need their family to agree with their boundaries. They've appointed themselves the sole authority on their own life. Jung called this process individuation, separating from the collective to become fully yourself. The empath separates not just from the narcissist, but from every belief system that kept them trapped. They separate from the idea that family is everything, even when family is toxic. They separate from the notion that forgiveness requires reconciliation. They separate from the belief that explaining yourself to people who are determined to misunderstand you is anything other than self-betrayal. This separation is surgical. The empath doesn't tear away in anger, they detach with precision. They remove the narcissist from their life the way a surgeon removes a tumor, carefully ensuring no malignant cells remain. They block without announcement. They move without forwarding addresses. They rebuild without providing updates on their progress. The narcissist expects the empath to stay engaged, even in departure. They expect angry texts, dramatic confrontations, demands for apologies. But the empath has accessed something Jung described as the death and rebirth archetype. The old self has died. The people-pleaser, the fixer, the eternal optimist who believed love could heal anything, that person is gone. What emerged from those ashes is someone who understands that some things aren't meant to be healed, just escaped. Jung wrote that loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. The narcissist has always been profoundly lonely because they cannot communicate authentically. Their entire existence is performance. But the empath discovers a different truth. Solitude after toxicity isn't loneliness. It's sanctuary. In that sanctuary, the empath rebuilds their identity without interference. They discover who they are when they're not constantly adjusting to someone else's mood. They learn what they actually enjoy when they're not performing enjoyment for someone else's benefit. They find their own rhythm when they're not dancing to someone else's chaotic tempo. This self-discovery makes them dangerous because they become immune to future narcissists. They've studied the pattern so thoroughly that they can spot it in the first conversation. The love bombing that once swept them off their feet now raises immediate red flags. The sob story that once activated their savior complex now makes them step back, not forward. The isolation tactics that once worked now trigger an instant exit. Jung believed that we cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. The empath has moved beyond condemning the narcissist. They've accepted that the narcissist is operating from a profound wound, a fractured sense of self, a desperate void that no amount of supply will ever fill. But acceptance doesn't mean participation. The empath can accept that the narcissist is broken without volunteering to be broken alongside them. The narcissist eventually realizes they're dealing with someone who has transformed completely. The empath who used to chase them during silent treatments now doesn't notice their absence. The empath who used to beg for breadcrumbs now has a full table and doesn't remember what hunger felt like. The empath who used to believe they needed the narcissist to feel whole now feels more whole than they've ever been. This completeness is the ultimate threat. Because the narcissist's power was always dependent on the empath feeling incomplete without them. Every manipulation tactic was designed to create, or deepen that sense of lack. But the empath filled their own void. They became their own source of validation, their own provider of love, their own greatest advocate. Jung said that the foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. The narcissist refuses their suffering, projecting it onto everyone around them. But the empath finally walked through their suffering rather than around it. They felt every ounce of pain, grief, rage, and betrayal. They didn't numb it or rush past it or pretend it wasn't there. They metabolized it, integrated it, and emerged transformed. This transformation is irreversible. The empath cannot be manipulated back into unconsciousness. They've seen behind the curtain. They know the tricks. They understand the game. And they've chosen not to play. The narcissist keeps waiting for an opening, a moment of weakness, a crack in the armor. But there is no armor. The empath doesn't need protection anymore because they've removed themselves from the battlefield entirely. They're not defending against the narcissist. They're simply living as if the narcissist doesn't exist. and for someone whose entire identity depends on having impact, this erasure is more devastating than any revenge. Jung taught that the creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect but by the play instinct. The empath has rediscovered play, joy, lightness. They laugh without calculating whether it will trigger someone's rage. They pursue dreams without worrying whether it will provoke jealousy. They love freely in relationships where love is reciprocated rather than weaponized. The fed-up empath becomes dangerous not through what they take from the narcissist, but through what they take back, themselves. Every piece of identity they'd surrendered, every dream they'd postponed, every truth they'd swallowed, they reclaim it all. And the narcissist is left with exactly what they always had: nothing real, nothing lasting, nothing true. Just a mirror they've spent their entire life running from, finally catching up. Jung warned that the pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. The narcissist lives perpetually in nonsense, creating chaos to avoid clarity. But the fed-up empath has finally found sense, not in understanding the narcissist, but in understanding themselves. And that understanding becomes the foundation for something the narcissist never anticipated: a life completely untouchable by their influence. The final stage of the empath's transformation is the most dangerous because it's the most complete. They don't just recover from the narcissist, they transcend the entire dynamic. They reach a place where the narcissist becomes irrelevant, not through effort or forced indifference, but through genuine evolution beyond the paradigm where that relationship could exist. Jung believed that the meeting with the shadow is the apprentice piece in an individual's development. The empath has completed their apprenticeship. They've met their shadow, the parts of themselves that allowed the abuse, that stayed too long, that ignored red flags painted neon bright. They've integrated those aspects without shame, understanding that every moment of that relationship was preparing them for this absolute freedom. This freedom terrifies the narcissist because it's contagious. Other people in the narcissist's orbit watch the empath thrive and start questioning their own participation in the narcissist's drama. The flying monkeys lose enthusiasm for their role. The news supply starts seeing cracks in the facade earlier. The narcissist's entire system destabilizes because one person stopped playing their assigned part. The empath becomes dangerous because they're proof that the narcissist's version of reality was always fiction. The narcissist said the empath was the problem: too sensitive, too demanding, incapable of being satisfied. But now the empath is satisfied, deeply, profoundly satisfied, in relationships and circumstances that have nothing to do with the narcissist. They're thriving in the exact ways the narcissist said they never would. Jung wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. The narcissist built an entire personality to avoid that confrontation. But the empath did the work the narcissist couldn't. They faced their soul, examined their wounds, took responsibility for their healing. And in doing so, they became someone the narcissist has no power over. The most dangerous moment comes when the narcissist realizes the empath isn't coming back. Not because they're still angry, anger would indicate the narcissist still matters. But because the empath has built something new, something beautiful, something the narcissist could never infiltrate or destroy. The door isn't locked. It simply no longer exists. Jung observed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The empath has claimed that privilege while the narcissist remains imprisoned in their false self. The empath knows their darkness and their light, their capacity for both cruelty and compassion. They've chosen compassion, but they no longer offer it where it's weaponized against them. This discernment creates an impenetrable boundary. The empath can now spot narcissism in its earliest stages and walk away without guilt, without explanation, without looking back. They've learned that not everyone deserves access to their energy. That some people are lessons, not destinations. That you can honor what a relationship taught you without ever speaking to that person again. The narcissist's final play is usually a grand gesture, a dramatic apology, a crisis that demands attention, a sudden revelation of change. But the fed-up empath sees it for what it is, the same pattern wearing a new costume. Jung would call this the trickster archetype, always shape-shifting, always performing, never real. The empath has learned to see past the costume to the emptiness beneath. What makes the empath truly dangerous in this final form is their peace. Not the fragile peace that requires perfect conditions, but the deep peace that exists regardless of external chaos. The narcissist can rage, smear, manipulate, and the empath's peace remains undisturbed. Because it's not built on the narcissist's approval or absence, it's built on self-knowledge and self-acceptance. Jung said that I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. The empath chooses to become whole. Not despite the narcissist, not because of the narcissist, but independent of the narcissist entirely. They extract the lessons and discard the teacher. They take the wisdom and leave the wound behind. The narcissist eventually moves on to new supply, convinced they've won because the empath isn't fighting for them anymore. But they've misunderstood everything. The empath wasn't fighting for the narcissist, they were fighting for themselves. And they won. Years pass. The empath builds a life rich with genuine connection, purpose, and joy. They occasionally remember the narcissist the way you remember a strange dream, with detached curiosity about how you ever believed it was real. The narcissist becomes a reference point, a before picture that makes the after even more striking. Jung taught that the most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security that is not easily disturbed. The empath has overcome the most intense conflict of their life. They've faced someone who tried to convince them they were worthless, and chose to believe in their own value instead. That security is unshakable. The final danger of the fed-up empath is this: they become living proof that narcissists don't win. They may claim victory, may move on to new victims, may never face consequences in any legal or social sense. But they lose the one battle that matters. They lose the ability to diminish someone's light permanently. The empath's light returns brighter than before, fueled by wisdom earned through survival. And that light illuminates the path for others still trapped, still confused, still believing the narcissist's lies. The fed-up empath doesn't destroy the narcissist. They simply become everything the narcissist claimed they'd never be: happy, whole, and finally, beautifully free.